Can everyone hear me? Good. I'm not sure how anyone can follow performance by any Michael Jackson, but I'll try my best. Michael made me quite subconscious about my pack of papers, so I'm going to push that over there and leave this in my hand. This is not the Herald, certainly not the newspaper I picked up this morning, and I'm going to Tim suggested we shorten my CV and just say dealing with challenges started in 1997, because that's really, if I look back over the years, just when you thought you've seen it all in the poultry industry or any livestock industry for that matter, you realize you haven't seen it all. And the past year in South Africa certainly has been one of those years. And I'm also looking forward to listening to the experts later today, because I don't consider myself an expert by any means. There are experts in the field of nutrition here, veterinary science, livestock production. They're going to give you all the magic answers to what it is you need to do in your businesses and your livestock production systems and your operations to improve profitability. I've got a bit of a helicopter view. I'm going to look at the challenges that face us today regionally, and then just some suggestions on how we can tackle them. And certainly by no means a textbook with all the answers on everything that we need to tackle. But before I get there, I can actually push all my slides aside, because Tim gave you half of the challenges we face this morning. And then on the plane last night, I picked up this newspaper at the airlink check-in, and was just reading it on the plane to Harare last night. And it was quite disappointing reading, in fact. And you can see by the color of my slides, they're a bit dull, not as vibrant as Michael's. I've got the topic today that's probably going to set the mood a little lower, and then hopefully we can pick it up at the end. But there was African Development Bank report that recently came out that has slashed South Africa's economic growth for 2023 and the effects of that on the region, including all the other SADC countries. It's warned of energy and logistical constraints. It's warned of civil unrest, natural disasters such as flood, droughts, local infestation, a cost of living crisis, electricity crisis, all which will hamper economic growth and social cohesion. It said the outlook for 2023 and 24 was uncertain, because the Southern African region remains subject to significant downside risks. Goes on to talk about the external outlook clouded with many risks. The war in Ukraine, geopolitical tensions, spurring food and energy price inflation, which will impact food importing countries. It really goes on. I could spend probably in the next half hour reading the article. Climate change, we've seen a little bit about that. But these are the challenges. And then Tim mentioned some this morning on livestock production systems. There is one little glimmer of hope that I could find on this whole page, and it was the one behind the red wine stain. It's a little bit, the seating on airlink's a little tight, so I did spill some wine on here, but there was a little glimmer of hope here at the end, and I will share that with you later, because I think it ties in well to what Michael spoke of in one of his slides. But we'll get back there a little later. But getting into the crux of the slide pack, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the global livestock market and what does that mean for us as livestock producers in the region, what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa with meat consumption and meat consumption trends. A little bit of a SWOT analysis for SADC. Sorry, this is the MBA part that came out there, Michael. We can skip that slide very quickly. You can certainly read it in your own time later. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it did help me guide a little bit of the discussion around the challenges that we face for livestock production in the region. So we're going to look at these main risk factors and then present some options to mitigate them later. But those options to mitigate the challenges and risks that I'll highlight will be followed on by those specialist talks that you will follow up in the breakaway sessions. So by no means is this the whole textbook on how to sort out all of our problems, and then we will conclude. So we tend to compare ourselves to others, but we should not be discouraged by the success of others. It's very easy to look at your neighbors, look at the rest of the world, and say, why do we regionally or in our country have all of these issues, get dragged down by it, feel a bit depressed by the situation around us? You have to make up your own path. And I think by hitting the challenges head on, assessing the risks head on, and then looking at the options that we can take to mitigate some of these risks and improve our businesses, we should do that. And we should never give up. I saw it sitting in a chair there next to Tim, on the side of, sorry Michael, your cigar box. It says, quit now. Michael's brain obviously is not the bungee jump one. It's saying, well, I'm not going to quit now. I'll still enjoy a cigar every now and again. But the quit now part is the never give up part. You know, that was the only two words I could see. But we should not quit. We should never quit. We'll have to keep on fighting for what is rightfully our space as livestock producers, because that's what we are in the region, and fight for our fair share of the market. So global meat production by type. I'm not going to get into the detail here. I think the positive message from this is that global production for meat has been increasing. There's been an increasing trend in the production of poultry. Pork, unfortunately, showed some decline, and that was on the back of African swine fever. In China, I see that is on the agenda today, so there will be people talking about that, or experts talking about that. But in general, the message here is that meat production is increasing. We can see that in the stats between 2021 and 2022, although in Africa, you can see there's some room for improvement, and there's some work that we can do to increase our share of production on the global stage. We're very small in this global stage. And I put Astral here just purely as a benchmark. Tim mentioned we're the largest poultry producer in South Africa. That's some space we've grown into over time. Certainly wasn't always the case. But if you have a look at this, the point is that in a global context, we're a little pinprick at the bottom of the world. And we often forget that although we occupy that very small space, we're very important regionally and to food production and food security in our own countries. But we have to do that in the face of a number of challenges every single day. So 65% of all poultry meat is produced by the world's 50 largest producers from 3 countries. I mean, that's astounding figures. Brazil, US, China. Equivalent to 17.6 billion broilers per annum, and Astral now producing around 300 million birds per annum. So small on the global stage, but we can draw on the expertise and the knowledge of those on the global stage to improve our businesses. Here's an opportunity. Annual meat consumption per capita. Africa on average 6.3 kilos per person per annum. I spent a lot of time in Ethiopia a few years ago. There the consumption is less than 2 kilos per person per annum. In South Africa, 39 kilos of chicken per person per annum. Zambia, I think, is a little more than 12 kilos. So what we see is opportunity. I mean, if the Europeans can eat 25 kilos of chicken per person per annum, there must be space for us to grow into. And if you look at the Americas, that doesn't include North America, which is slightly higher than that. There's an opportunity for us to produce more protein locally, making up a greater proportion of consumption locally. What's happening in sub-Saharan Africa? The meat consumption trends here. Poultry on the rise, as you can see on the top graph. So that's the evolution of the per capita consumption for poultry. Little stagnant on beef, pork, and others, but you can see that poultry production and consumption certainly has been improving in the region over time. that has tied in quite closely with population growth. And Africa, as we know, has high population growth rate, and with that, there should be an increasing demand for meat. And that's the space we need to occupy. And we need to keep up with that increasing demand for meat. We need to do that profitably, and we need to do that efficiently, and focus on our local production livestock systems, improve them, and make sure that we all benefit from this chosen business space that we occupy. So here's the boring MBA part, SWOT analysis for SADC. This I've only used to draw on certain risks and threats and opportunities that are presented in the region. Strengths, we've already mentioned a couple. Growing population equals growing demand. We have tremendous port access around our coastlines. Yes, we've got some landlocked regional countries, but certainly distribution networks within those regions can be improved. And not only is the port infrastructure strength, but then we need to look at the opportunities that are presented by that. We've got fertile soils for crop production. Primary coarse grain production regionally is a strong point, or should be a stronger point for us all. There is nothing that should hold us back producing staples and coarse grains, not only for human consumption, but for animal feed consumption. And that is certainly a space that we know we can occupy, and we should do that in the best interests of the country and food security. I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you have a look at the threats quickly, because some of them come up later, we have very volatile currencies in our region, low foreign direct investment and investment protection in some cases, regional politics and policy uncertainty certainly playing a role in many of our macro landscapes in many countries these days. Climate change we already mentioned. Livestock diseases is a big one. It's a threat not only regionally but globally. The AI we talk about is avian influenza, not the artificial intelligence that Michael spoke about earlier. Bird flu, as we commonly call it. That's a major threat to global poultry production. And even the Brazilians are highly concerned about it now, because they have it in wild birds and they have it in commercial poultry in one of their major poultry producing states in Brazil. So a concern there, and it's reared its ugly head again back in South Africa. And Sean is here today, and he'll be talking to us later on about highly pathogenic avian influenza. Then imports and dumping, etc., etc. But in your own time, you certainly can take a look at what I deem to be some of the strong points, opportunities, threats for the region. Out of that, I've drawn on 5 key challenges for livestock production in the region. What does the macro environment hold? And those are largely factors that are outside of our control. External factors that we can often do very little about, but factors that we should gear ourselves up for. And we've learned the hard way in South Africa now that those external factors, such as the supply of electricity that you've relied on for many, many, many years, can just disappear overnight and hurt your business. You have to gear yourselves up for a future where you have instability in the power grid and uncertain water supply. We know that now. We're becoming experts in the challenges that face us in livestock production. And unfortunately, the hard way and financially costly to our business environment and to the specific businesses in South Africa, including Astrals. The availability of key ingredients. What is the availability of key ingredients regionally, and how does that impact us as livestock producers? You can't produce poultry and pork intensively without good quality animal feed and key coarse grain ingredients. You need the raw materials. It's the first thing we look at when we go to enter a new market, is what is the availability of raw materials? Do you have to import everything? If you have to import, it costs you money. There's also insecurity in importing all of your animal feed ingredient inputs. What are the livestock production systems that exist? Those present their own challenges. We'll get into that a little bit later. Animal feed and nutrition. Rick Klein is here today from SpecFeed. He'll be talking to you later about genetic potential, optimizing the genetic potential of the poultry breeds through animal nutrition. How do we take advantage of that in our livestock production systems? And I'm sure Tim and his team through 5-8 will be able to give you far more information on what you should be doing specifically in your own operations to optimize the genetic potential of your livestock through better feeding and good nutrition. And then animal health, same thing. I think if we get that wrong, there's a lot of other things that won't go right in our businesses. Just very quickly on the macro environment. We've mentioned this already. It was in the newspaper. Political instability. Not a lot you can do about it. I offer some perspective on it later. But of course, that creates uncertainty in our futures. We have policy uncertainty from governments, typically when we're approaching election time. As you are now in Zimbabwe and as we are in 2024 in South Africa, there's far less focus on the troubles at hand and the problems in the country and how does the government of the day solve them, and far more focus on the political future of those parties that are in power and how do they garner the support that they need for the elections. So policy uncertainty certainly is something, or policy decision making is certainly something that takes a back seat at that time. That's my experience, or our experience in South Africa, and it's something we're seeing right now as 2024 approaches. Infrastructure failure, poor service delivery. I told you this was the depressing part of this morning's lineup of presentations, but we can hopefully improve that a little later. This is a fact of life now. If you think you're alone with power cuts and no water, please don't believe that for one moment. South Africa is having its fair share of, as you know, and you've probably seen it in the newspapers and the press, load shedding. And it's costing the economy dearly. And as highlighted in this report last night, is dragging regional economies down with it. And it's something that we're going to have to work hard on to fix. In fact, I think we've got more load shedding in South Africa at the moment than you do in Zimbabwe. That's how bad it's getting. You then put diesel generators in, you've got backup supply of power at a hell of a diesel cost, and then there's a water interruption. You cannot process poultry without water. So infrastructure failure, poor service delivery, really concerning, and something that will have to be dealt with at a macro level. But of course there are some backup solutions that we can put in place. They're grudge purchases because it typically means installing your own sources of power and water at a hell of a cost, which you would rather take that capital invested in efficiencies and growth. Now you have to spend it on generators and water tanks. Low economic growth and inflation. I think that's a storybook for a number of countries regionally at the moment. High unemployment rates, putting pressure on consumer disposable income. At the end of the day, people have to have money in their pocket to pay for their data for their cell phone, their transport every day, and to buy food. And the more and more pressure that's placed on that disposable income, we find that people spend, unfortunately, less and less on food. They start buying down. In poultry, we first see them buying down into chicken. That's the one positive with poultry farming. They'll buy out of certain cuts and into tertiaries. But we do see people not eating beef, for example, or pork, or any of the other protein sources because they simply become too expensive. We have a responsibility as livestock producers then to make sure we produce at the best cost possible to get an affordable protein source on shelf, because there is pressure on consumer disposable income. It is there, and it's been felt by many regional economies. State functions. These are also largely neglected in many countries, unfortunately, and something that certainly can improve. The support to the agricultural sector in rural economies is very important. And that's where 5Et and others are playing a very important role now, taking over the role or the historical role of extension officers and extension services. So these are your partners now in the success of your businesses. Just to show you that it is very real, this is South Africa's unemployment rate statistics. This figure doesn't include those that have also given up all hope of looking for work. So South Africa currently sits with a record high unemployment rate. That's not good for our economy, it's not good for our business. Availability of key ingredients. That was one of the other key challenges for livestock production. We've spoken earlier on about primary coarse grain production. It's very important that you have that. It's key to the success of your farming enterprises. You need to be able to produce animal feed locally at the best cost possible, optimizing the source of nutrients through each raw material at the cost that you find that raw material on the day. And if we don't produce a lot of these key inputs locally, and you, as I said earlier on, you want to import them, you will slowly but surely increase your cost base. That will make you less and less competitive, not only in your own country's market, but those regional markets that we have access to as well. Of course, we're not immune to global shocks in the maize price. The Ukraine crisis is a classic example. We've seen that in the last week as well, with Russia deciding once again to close the grain corridor from Ukraine. It sent panic back into the markets. We've seen a rally in the Chicago Board of Trade price for maize or corn. And then, of course, there's some drier weather in the US. So they're panicking about the yields of their crop that's in the ground. And that creates some shocks on the global markets. And we feel that in the price of maize and coarse grains in our own countries. I'll show you a slide on that just now. Exchange rate volatility. One thing I want to point out here is sometimes volatility also presents opportunity. So if we talk later on about how do we deal with this, sometimes it's not just by fancy financial instruments. Within the volatility, it creates opportunity to hedge the currency. And it might mean on the day just buying right, looking for the down days. And I'm sure I can't tell many Zimbabweans about how to manage the influence of a volatile local currency on your businesses. I think you can probably teach the world something about that. Dependency on imports, we've spoken about. Cost of key inputs. So you've got to put a crop in the ground, but you also need a fertilizer. The Ukraine-Russia crisis has also sent the global price of fertilizer soaring. So the key input costs have gone up. These are all key challenges that will later on filter into your businesses as livestock producers. We're not immune to cost input pressure. Weather phenomena. Of course we will experience droughts. We're going into an El Nino phase now. It's developing quite quickly already. That will mean drier weather conditions for us regionally over the next couple of years. Is it a bad thing? Of course, a drought's not a good thing, and it can affect crop production. But the rest of the world also needs rain. And with the La Nina weather phenomena, the North Americas and Argentina have not had good rainfall. So the global maize or corn balance sheet's under tremendous pressure with supply and demand. The stock-to-use ratios are very low. It's under a lot of pressure. It sends the prices up. We need rain around other parts of the world as well so that we can see a comfortable balance sheet for coarse grains in the world and better pricing of these commodities on the global stage. Storage and transport. You can have all the ingredients you want, but if you aren't able to store them or move them, distribute them, transport them, that doesn't help you either. So your infrastructure is important. What we've seen in South Africa, and forgive me for using South Africa or talking about it often through the presentation, but it's a very real example at the moment of what you shouldn't do if you want to get things right. And we've seen a deterioration in our rail infrastructure, second to none, that where we used to transport maize from inland country to the coastal towns, 80% of that maize used to move by rail, 20% by road. It's now completely the other way around. If you're lucky, 10 to 20% moves by rail and 80 to 90% by road. It doubles the cost of transporting those raw materials to the markets where you need them, and it increases the cost of production, something that you can't recover easily through a consumer that's under stress. Again, to show you real world examples, the numbers aren't important here. This is the Chicago Board of Trade corn price. Just look at the volatility that we've seen in recent times in that market. All started with the Ukraine crisis and then various other shocks through the system, lately trading very much a weather market. You then add on top of that the currency. This isn't the Zimbabwe dollar, this is the rand, but it's starting to look like the Zimbabwe dollar. You've now got to choose when you want to price your raw material positions and within all this volatility. So you can have a stable Chicago Board of Trade price for a couple of weeks, but then you have to deal with the volatility in your local currency. This is what's happened to Safex's yellow maize price. Fortunately, we've seen some softening in prices in our markets in recent times, but we reached a record high of 5,200 Rand a ton in December last year. With all the other challenges that you experience in your operations at that time, you also have record high input costs or feed prices. At that time, it's critically important to get the other things right. Feeding, optimizing genetic potential, managing the bird, managing the environment. If you get a whole lot of the other things wrong at a time that you sit with the highest feed input prices, then it's going to go horribly wrong. And we'll see later on that it's not just the things you can see that you have to manage. Livestock production systems. I mean, there's experts in the room here that will talk to you at length about this. How do we farm? Is it intensively or extensively? Do we use a mixed farming system, or are we using a landless system to produce our livestock? Are we subsistence farmers, small-scale farmers, or commercial farmers? Those various operational dynamics all bring in economies of scale that you as an individual in your business have to deal with. A small-scale farmer will face far greater challenges than perhaps a larger producer that has the benefit of volume through the business, can dilute fixed costs better and produce more efficiently. But we have to cater for each one of those livestock production systems. And it is possible to improve the production within a small-scale environment. Back to the Ethiopia example again. I visited a small-scale farmer just outside Addis in the Oromia region who was producing Ross broilers, 1.92 kilo body weight, but taking 60 to 64 days to achieve the weight. And then you looked at the feed they were feeding, mash. No pellets. Pellets weren't something that anyone had heard of in the region. And what was in the mesh? Well, that was also hard to tell. But I can tell you now that it wasn't optimized nutrition to achieve the genetic potential of that bird. Just put better feed in front of that bird or animal, manage the environment, and you have the opportunity to optimize the genetic potential so that you can achieve a 1.8 kilo bird at 33 or 34 days, whatever it will be. There is that opportunity does exist, and Rick will talk to you at length about that later. So the economics of a livestock system and the flow of essential food products to the market are closely intertwined. You know, if you get the economics wrong, unfortunately, you will not see the pull of your products into, or your essential outputs into the food markets. If it's too costly, it simply won't sell, and you will not be competitive against the next operator or the next product that occupies shelf space in store, whatever that is, whether it's a formal retail, spaza shop, wholesale market, doesn't matter. If you're not competitive, your product won't sell. You have to look at employing technology in operations. This is something now although we're the small producer down here at the bottom of Africa, we do compete on a global stage for resources. Technology is available. We've got some of the equipment suppliers here today. You have to make use of technology in livestock production systems to optimize the available efficiencies from the various species or livestock systems, particularly the intensive systems such as poultry. The technology is available for us to improve the performance of our animal husbandry. Availability of skills, something unfortunately both within our own countries and regionally that we're facing. We're facing a shortage of skills. The tertiary institutions aren't producing enough of this of the skill set or the people that we need with the necessary skill set to put into our livestock production environment. And that's unfortunate. It's not an attractive industry these days for people to go into. I don't know of many people nowadays that leave matric and say, I'm going to go and be a poultry farmer. Fully utilize the formal animal feed production environment. And that is well developed in South Africa. It is well developed in Zimbabwe. It's well developed in Zambia. Fortunately, other African countries I've visited, it is not as well developed. But it creates an opportunity as well. Although it's a challenge, it creates an opportunity. And we can be grateful that we have these formalized animal feed production systems available to us in country, and the likes of companies such as Fivet, who support your local livestock production systems with good quality feed. We have to make use of all the available technologies in the production of that feed, and I've got a small example later, but I'm sure there will be others that cover it in far more detail. Quality control and feed safety systems, often a part that is somewhat neglected, not only on your incoming feed ingredients or raw materials, but on your outgoing feed. You must make use of the laboratory support that is available out there to make sure you know what you're putting into your feed, and to make sure you know that that finished feed or final feed product you get out at the end of the day will satisfy the nutrient requirements of your livestock production system or that broiler. That is key to achieving the correct feed conversion efficiency or rate, which is every kilo of feed that you put in, how much live weight do I get out? What is the efficiency with which that animal or that bird converts the feed into protein live weight gain? That's a critical measurement. And we then talk about biological efficiencies. You have to measure, and we'll talk about that later. If you don't constantly get feedback from your livestock system, where you can make adjustments, corrections, and improvements, you won't exploit the opportunities that are available in the efficiencies by which that bird or animal can convert feed. And it's all about margin over feed cost. This is a very important point and something which we tend to neglect or forget, but it's something critical in our daily and our weekly business environment within Astral. What margin over feed cost are we achieving on a particular feeding program? On that bird, through that cycle, we have to measure the performance right down to the third decimal point to make sure we know that we're extracting all the value we can on the available ingredients at their cost, at their nutritional quality, through that livestock production system. And that means tweaking many other things around just the feed. So we're constantly testing new feeding programs to make sure at a particular ingredient cost or final feed price, we are getting a certain level of performance or result from the bird, which optimizes the margin potential that exists over that feeding cost. And that's, you will probably find a lot online about this, and I urge you to look at it, because it's that final result of tweaking all the inputs into your livestock production system. 70% of input costs into the live cost of a chicken or a broiler today is feed. 70% of the cost is feed. It's a significant cost into the business. What margin do we achieve on that major cost input? Quality control. This is sunflower oil cake, I think it was. Look at the variability in crude protein levels around an expected standard of an incoming raw material into the feed mill. If you don't adjust for this or account for this, and here I'm talking probably more to the formal feed manufacturers because it's their responsibility, you will end up with the same variability in your final finished feed product, which will go through to your birds and your animals and will result in inconsistent performance. You have to manage this. This is the opportunity that's been presented over time by broiler genetics. Well, maybe not all the broiler genetics, some of them. I think this starts in 2013, if I remember, not important, but if you have a look at the left-hand axis, we've got a feed conversion rate of 1.65, and on the far right, 1.4. Do you know how much money exists in feeding 250 grams less feed for every kilo of live weight gain? That's what this graph tells you. So take any feed price. At that point and that point, you feed 250 grams less feed. Obviously, the economics of your operation improve. That benefit will go straight to your bottom line. And it's only by optimizing the genetic potential that's available to you. The genetics can do it. What are you doing to achieve it? Or what are your partners in your business, such as your suppliers, doing to assist you in achieving this? It can be done. And it's an opportunity that exists. Animal health. The prevalence of infectious diseases. Regionally, we have foot and mouth disease, we have African swine fever, we have highly pathogenic avian influenza, bird flu. These have the potential to wipe out your operation, unfortunately. And you'll see later, I put this right at the top of the priority list. These diseases are around. We have to manage in an environment today that exists with these livestock diseases, unfortunately. Bird flu is one of them. As Tim knows, I've cut my trip short by half a day, or a day. I need to get back. We're We have bird flu in South Africa. We have bird flu in a couple of our operations. It's become something you have to manage, deal with, and know that you are planning for, because it won't disappear without vaccination strategies. And I'm sure Sean will talk to you later about it. And it's almost becoming part of everyday livestock production, normalized livestock production, whereas in 2017 it was a massive shock to the system. South Africa, chickens, highly pathogenic bird flu, we all fell over backwards. Now it's something that's there and we have to deal with it, and we'll talk about biosecurity just now. I spoke earlier on about that little pinprick here at the bottom of the world. Well, there's a very real threat. Some of the big name pharmaceutical companies are either exiting the production of some of the key vaccines, or the supply of them is severely constrained. So what is the availability of vaccines on the global stage? We have to make sure that we're self-sufficient and we have the right strategies to be able to improve our livestock production by using vaccine strategies. I mean, AI is one of those. The world is now in conversation about vaccinating for bird flu, highly pathogenic bird flu. Positive sign is that at least the world is now having a conversation. There's a lot of countries against it because they export poultry. It obviously has consequences in country. But if you want to protect your pedigree flocks or those high-value, long-life birds, we're going to have to consider vaccination strategies in our countries. And it's something that we are vigorously discussing with the relevant authorities in South Africa at the moment. Of course, we all make use of therapeutic medication, antibiotics, etc. There's pressure from the world to reduce or restrict the use of these medication programs. Looking at alternatives. What are the alternatives? They're more natural alternatives, moving away from antibiotics. So that does create pressure on your livestock production system, because you have to adapt to these new medication programs and opportunities that exist without antibiotics. We may be some way off that, but this pressure is very real in Europe and other countries at the moment. Biosecurity measures extremely important. Animal movement, critical. I mean, if we recklessly move animals around country, it has dire consequences for everyone's farming systems. What disease control measures do we employ to combat the outbreak of these diseases? And how are we compensated for that? We're not. In many countries, if you have an outbreak of AI, the state takes control of the situation, implements a quarantine zone, cull the birds, dispose of them safely, compensate you. In South Africa, we first struggled to get hold of the state vet. It takes 3 or 4 days. By the time they were out on farm, we've culled all the birds already ourselves, safely disposed of them, and then ask for quarantine to be placed over the farm. Because the sooner that we have quarantine status in place, is the sooner we can get to a disease-free status by cleaning up that particular production unit. So, as always, here in Africa, we do things slightly differently. But that places challenges on us as producers, and we have to adapt to that. And compensation is something that we don't get. We should do under our Animal Diseases Act. We should receive compensation for employing a disease control measure to combat the outbreak of a highly infectious disease. But in reality, that's not the case. This is AI around the world. Frightening. And I won't get into all the detail, but over the past winter season, North America and Europe have had rampant outbreaks of AI. And particularly, Zimbabwe, I know, has had 1 or 2 cases over the years, But South Africa, in the wild bird surveillance that we do, I would say in 95 to 98% of the cases, fecal samples that we take from waterfowl or other bird species, they are positive for avian influenza. On your farms, that is the frightening part. Now you have to keep that out of your poultry sheds. How do you do that? You have to use every biosecurity tool or measure that's available to you in your toolbox. And unfortunately, sometimes that's not enough to keep it up. But, so there's a whole list of problems. Obviously, not all nice reading. But we should not give up in the face of adversity. And I think this comment or quote is very true. That every problem contains the seed of its own solution. Here's my Eisenhower napkin. It's not as pretty and colorful as yours. But what we try to do here, and this is subjective, please. People may approach this very differently, but we took all these challenges, and what I wanted to attempt to do for you is just place them on some sort of matrix so that we can draw some element of importance as to where they might reside within your livestock production system or operational space. We looked at the probability of such an event and then the potential impact of such an event. And you can see that in some cases, probably a bit biased, because we've seen infrastructure failure there on the extreme right in South Africa, having a massive impact on our operations. The probability of those events now is very high. Animal health, they're pointing to some of the key highly infectious animal diseases. High impact on your business. Probability of occurring, very, very good. That's the environment that we have to farm in today. And there's a whole lot of others. I pulled the key ones out of the challenges that I've listed for you, placed them on this matrix. What I've tried to do from that is develop some sort of scorecard against which I can maybe offer some form of solution or some mitigation strategy. And as I said earlier on, certainly by no means a textbook of all the solutions and opportunities available to you. But we face external environmental factors, we face challenges from the internal environment, those you are under your control, those you can do something about, and we shouldn't forget that. And what are the options or strategies to consider? I've listed them here. I took a weighting of that probability and impact score and listed them according to a weighting, again, subjective. Something I sat down and did, but really just to try and get some thought process into what are the business challenges we face. And sorry, the slide is a little bit small up there, but these slides will be distributed to you, I'm sure, Tim, and we'll get them out to you. But I've classified them according to an external and internal impact, and then some of the mitigation strategies. So what can we do about animal health? Well, you should employ good biosecurity measures. You should look at medication strategies and vaccination strategies. Infrastructure failure, what can we do there? Well, we have to become self-sufficient. Unfortunately, it comes at a cost, and it comes at an operational running cost. Economic growth, unemployment rate, disposable income. What can you do about it? Well, try and produce the protein that you do of your livestock production system at the best possible cost. Create an affordable protein that people can afford to buy when their spending power or their purse is under tremendous pressure. That's something that is incumbent on all of us as farmers to do, is to become efficient and produce at best cost. I won't go through the whole list. Weather phenomena. Have a look at your procurement strategy and your particular production system. Policy uncertainty. we say, well, there's nothing really we can do about that. Oh, that's not true. Make sure you've got a strong industry association or representation. Make sure you engage with authorities, that they understand your challenges and the risk to your operating environment. That's the least you can do. We might not always get the answers we require or the outcomes that we desire, but engage with the authorities. Access to markets. You will, in many cases, have to develop your own supply chains and develop your own markets. But what is a positive trend is that in the region, we're seeing the formal retail space develop more and more. We're seeing the quick service restaurant trade improving and that space developing, and that all pulls on protein and the products that we can offer them and produce for those markets. This is one cycle through a particular broiler operation in South Africa. 24 farms. This is the PEF range across all those farms in one cycle. The PEF is a performance efficiency factor. It's a factor developed from the live weight, age, feed conversion rate, and mortality or livability of the birds. What you should focus on doing is focus on the bottom 25% of those low-performing farms that you can lift the performance of. That will improve, even if it's at one shed, that one poultry shed on your farm, that will improve your profitability. Nearly done. Diet structure, I'm not going to talk about this, I'm sure Rick can speak to you hours about this, but look at the benefits between feeding a mash feed and a pelleted feed to poultry or broiler performance. Significant benefit in that, and that is something that is really elementary these days, but we still find it from time to time and market to market, in country to country, where people are not feeding, never mind the right nutritional quality feed to their animals, they're not feeding the right feed format to improve intake. Now, there's a lot of things we've spoken about. Some of them are very visible to us, but it's this typical or this glacier effect. You can only see what's above the water. You can't see what's below the water. What's below the water is as important to your business as to what's above the water, the Titanic effect. There's a whole range of other important factors to consider in your livestock production system. Go through this in your own time. It's not feed, it's not just feed formulation, it's not just the ingredient costs I've spoken about, it's all the other things that play an extremely important role in livestock production. Feedback. Your birds will tell you what's right and what's wrong. Get into the poultry shed and listen to them. Watch them, look at their behavior. They'll quickly tell you they're not happy, either with the water, the feed, or the environment. Take that data, take that recognition, feed it back into your management programs. It'll help you improve livestock production and efficiencies on farm. Make sure you make use of all your partners in the value chain. Private. We all have an integrated livestock production system with input suppliers. Utilize the skills base that's available to you in that value chain. And in conclusion, we face an immensely challenging environment. Many factors are outside of our control, but there are measures that we can choose to mitigate these. The internal business environment, again, just to remind you, is very much within our control. The positive part is that protein production in the region remains a viable opportunity, supported by increasing population growth, demand for chicken, for beef, for protein. There's a per capita consumption opportunity. We have to feed our populations a balanced diet. We have to improve local production. We can do that to support food security, and there's improving access to market. So if we capitalize on all of these benefits, there's no reason why, and tackle all the challenges and risks that I've listed for you, there's no reason why you can't improve the profitability of your farming operations or livestock production systems. And getting back to that newspaper earlier on, where there was one little glimmer of hope yesterday, it said here, we need to work smarter and we need to work harder. I think we all know nothing in life comes easy, and certainly if we employ a number of the risk mitigation strategies that I've listed or briefly discussed, you'll hear more about it later, we can work smarter. And don't give up. And I think that was a key message from Michael earlier on today, and I thank you very much for listening.